This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to our very special guest today, Sam Quinones, author of the book Dreamland, the true tale of America's opiate epidemic, and the book The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. Links to learn more about Sam Quinones and his books can be found at his author website, samquinones.com, or in the show notes. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon. By joining on Patreon, you go a long way to help keeping Beyond the Big Screen going, and you get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. By supporting Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon, you are going a long way to helping make this show sustainable and continue to for a long time in the future. So I really appreciate you considering becoming a supporter on Patreon. A special thanks goes out to our supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you today to our executive producer, Alex. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies, and stories so great they should be movies by going to the website beyondthebigscreen.com. You'll learn all about show notes as well as how to support the show on Patreon. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Thank you so much for joining us again on Beyond the Big Screen. I am really excited to be joined by Sam Quinones. Sam is an independent journalist and is author of a number of really great books, including the books that we will focus on today. His latest book, The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. Sam is also the author of Dreamland, the true story of America's opiate epidemic. Sam, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in investigating these drug epidemics in the U.S.?
Sure. Stephen, great to be with you. I really had no interest, I have to tell you honestly, I had no interest in addiction or pain management or any of that stuff. I had lived in Mexico for 10 years as a journalist. I've been a reporter 35 years. I've been a crime reporter a lot of those years, and that's kind of how I see myself in general. And I lived in Mexico for 10 years, came back to LA, which is my kind of roughly my home region, and got a job at the LA Times, and they put me on a story. They put me on a team of reporters writing about the drug war that had just kicked off in Mexico. When I lived in Mexico, it was 94 to 2004. I mean, there was nothing like what's happened since. It was a easy country to move around in. There was very little danger, it seemed to me. I was a freelancer, very vagabonding all over the place. It was not a dangerous thing. And then all of a sudden, it became deadly. And so my job was to write about drugs as they trafficked. After they crossed the border, how they got to the rest of the country. And as part of that, I got onto the story in Dreamland of the town of Jalisco in the state of Nayarit, Mexico, small state on the Pacific coast of Mexico, in which people had devised a system of delivering heroin, very much like pizza delivery. So you call a number and the operator takes your order and they send a driver to you to deliver your heroin. And not only that, though, the real importance to this group, in my opinion, was that they were intensely expansionary. So they began to move all over the country. They were everywhere. They were in Phoenix and Reno. Then they moved across the Mississippi, and they were in Columbus and Charlotte and various places, about 20, 25 states eventually. I think I counted them in. Anyway, as I was doing that, I began to realize there was a much, much bigger story behind me that I was unaware of because I had been in Mexico when it really evolved. And that was the revolution in pain management with regard to the very, very aggressive use of opioid painkillers, narcotic painkillers, Vicodin, Percocet, Oxycontin, very well known. And so that was how you explained why these guys had this growing heroin market. I could not explain why they had it growing. I thought, who would ever go back to using heroin? I mean, I thought the 70s were the time when we forgot about heroin. We learned it was a bad drug and moved on. And so it was that revolution in pain management that I realized was much bigger than anything I was dealing with these guys from Mexico. And so I began to see the two stories as connected. And that's when I began to really figure all that out. I really had a lot of background in Mexico. By that point, I had written 2 books about Mexico and knew a lot about small town Mexican life and immigration and all that. I didn't know a thing about addiction. Didn't really know what an Oxycontin was when I started all this, but it was backing into the story with the heroin and all, coming to this realization that I was really focusing on the smaller story, the much bigger story affecting the entire country was the opioid pain revolution.
It's so interesting you mentioned that the change in Mexico in that time you were living there. I'm originally from upstate New York, and we go to Canada. Just going to Canada is like nothing. It's like going to the next town over. And we moved to Texas, and I asked somebody, can you just, pop over to Juarez or Laredo? And they were like, that's probably not the best idea. And that you're saying that changed very recently?
I would say that changed in 2000, began to change in 2005 and 6. That's when you begin to see the first cartel wars. A lot of this has to do with Chapo Guzman. Chapo Guzman was the head of the Sinaloa cartel. He was in prison for a lot of years. He escaped in a variety of kind of very corrupt ways in which, anyway, it's a long story but he gets out. And when he gets out, he begins to kind of throw his weight around the country a little bit and disrupt a lot of the old ways of controls that had been in place for drug trafficking at the different border areas. So he begins to attack Juarez, begins to attack Tijuana, and he also begins to attack the Texas border side. So he's got all these things going across, and that's why these cartel wars begin to pop off beginning in about those years. And that's why Laredo, but particularly Reynosa, McAllen, those areas get extraordinarily dangerous. Tijuana, Juarez, and a few years later, you begin to see murder rates through the roof. 3,000 murders a year in Juarez becomes the most dangerous place on the planet. That's what I understood. All of that because of these these attempts at control and battling back by Chapo Guzman and his troops kind of. And then, of course, the Mexican government gets involved and the army. And so you've got really various wars going on around the country over direct routes into the United States, over who controls which city. And they would pop off, they would emerge. Acapulco was a big one for a while. Then it faded, then it reemerged, and it became extraordinarily savage. I mean, just scary. I never saw the kinds of stuff. When I was living in Mexico, I never saw a beheading. Ever, not once. And when I was in, after that, the war kicks off, you begin to have monthly totals counted by newspapers of how many beheadings they've had in Mexico in the last month, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow. Now, Dreamland was really the story of, as you said, the opioid epidemic, and that really took it to the next level with this cheap and really convenient heroin that was coming out of Mexico. But as I read The Least of Us, it's almost like the drugs war and the drug epidemic was evolving and changing almost at the same time. What did you notice in your investigation of that?
It's a good point. Exactly. The underworld is one of the most quickly evolving, segments of the economy. Really, it's just remarkable how fast it can change, and sometimes how innovative it is, but often how imitative it is as well. I have to say, you get both. But basically, the pain pill prescribing kind of began to blow up in the late 90s into the 2000s. The reason I wrote about the town Jalisco and Nayarit was because they were the first ones. Those guys were the first ones to recognize what was coming. That if they followed the pills, they sold their heroin in those areas, they would have a bigger market for heroin than they ever thought possible. They were small fry, though. Eventually, the Sinaloa groups begin to get into it, and by 2010, you basically have seen, 15 years into it, you've definitely seen now the big groups understanding that there's a big market there too. So everybody's selling into it. At the same time, though, the trafficking world begins to figure out that synthetic drugs are a better way to go. Making your own drugs from chemicals rather than growing them under the sun, with farmers and pesticides and all the rest. And so they discover two things really at roughly about the same time. One is fentanyl. Fentanyl is an opioid. It hits our brains very much like heroin does, like the opioid, but it's made entirely from chemicals. No plant, no poppies involved in fentanyl. It's a wonderful surgical tool, and in operating rooms, it's been used for 60 years, very, very effectively and wonderfully. I've had fentanyl myself in an operation, but it's so potent and such a huge profit center, so profitable that the traffic in the hands of traffickers that once they discovered it. It wasn't long before they just began to really market it. And that's what begins to happen. They discover it essentially in 2006 from an amateur chemist, underground, illegal chemist, who then is arrested. And so when he leaves, they don't have access to him. But eventually they find others, and eventually they're producing it. Now basically it's all being produced by the fentanyl that we're seeing is all being produced by Mexico. But you could see that the change began as traffickers began to understand that there were so many more benefits to selling synthetic drugs, making your own drugs from chemicals rather than growing them. You don't need land, you don't need sunshine, you don't need rainfall, any of that stuff. All you need is shipping ports to get your chemicals. And when you have control of that, which they do on the Pacific coast of Mexico, then you can make as many of these drugs as you want, and the chemicals will allow. And they have that is exactly what's happened. But that began to really emerge in a big way. You can say the supplies began to just flood the United States of two drugs in particular, fentanyl, as I mentioned, and methamphetamine, two very different drugs, but nevertheless, both very easy to make synthetically. And that begins to really happen by 2013, 14, you're seeing meth really take over and march across the country, and fentanyl about a year later, 2014, 15, 16, and so by then, very quickly you're seeing with fentanyl, it crowd out all the heroin. So we are really in a time now when we're going to see almost no heroin on the streets of America within a year or two now. We're almost there already.
When you had described in Dreamland, the gangs they're almost not even gangs, the guys from Nayarit in Jalisco, yes. They are basically just running a small business. It just happens to be an illegal business, but it's a small business, and they weren't, at least the way you described it, over the top violent or anything like that. Were they pushed out? Are they still in the game?
I think they're still in the game, but they were these major players at that time in the 90s, in the early 2000s, in the areas where they landed, like Columbus, Charlotte, Cincinnati, Louisville, Indianapolis, there's some others, Nashville, some other places like that on the east of the Mississippi River. And they were the first ones to ever bring black tar heroin, which is kind of very, rudimentary form of heroin. Looks like Tootsie Roll, really, east of the Mississippi River. And that's when they landed, they saw the pills involved, and they became these major forces in certain areas of the states that I mentioned for a while. But then the whole market just blew up geometrically expanding, all these new players, both Americans and Mexicans in America. And then down in Mexico, everybody also begins to say, damn, we need to start getting on the heroin bandwagon. And then, of course, it's fentanyl. Now, of course, it's been fentanyl for several years, because it just makes so much more sense. You don't have to grow anything anymore. But the Nayarit boys, the Jalisco boys, I think they're generally still doing this, but they're not the big fish in the small pond. The pond is a vast ocean now, and they're minor players, really. There's so many more people involved that they're not, they're still doing their thing. I've been assured. But nobody cares. It's not the same story. It was not, I focused on them because they were the ones who saw this first. And then they not only saw it, they systematically exploited it with their pizza delivery system. But then they became kind of footnotes after that.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I guess to follow up to into the next step, it's meth, and meth has evolved so much. I mean, I think if you think back to the 80s, the 90s, meth was something that maybe a trucker would take to stay awake, or, I always associated with bikers, and they'll party for a week straight. But the picture you paint of meth today is an incredibly different picture than that.
Yeah, and that happened about the same time. I mean, these changes have their roots in roughly the years 2006 to 2009. Fentanyl, they discovered fentanyl down in Mexico. Then it's the same thing. They also had to switch. They had to change how they made meth in Mexico. The traffickers in Mexico had really industrialized the production of methamphetamine with a precursor chemical called ephedrine, which is in, it's a decongestant in Sudafed pills, that kind of thing. And the Mexican government saw this and decided we got to do something about it. So they drastically regulated the importation of ephedrine and who could actually possess it, which only a few companies now are able to actually possess legally, of course, possess it. When that began to happen, the trafficking world had to switch. Now, ephedrine meth is a very easy form of meth to make. It's not hard to do. And that's how they became kind of knowledgeable about how to make methamphetamine, because it was so easy to do, really. The methamphetamine made with ephedrine, meth was a kind of a euphoric drug. You want to party all the time. You wanted to be around people all the time. You were, as one guy told me, you wanted to be you were everybody's best friend. And it was a party drug. They had to switch then to another way of making methamphetamine. There is another way. It's an old way, but it was new to them. And the meth that they began to make was with a chemical called P2P, phenyl to propanone. They began to use it, make it that way because phenyl 2-propanone is essential precursor in this method, is very easy to make with lots of different chemicals. So, and these chemicals are all very easily available. They're industrial, they're legal, and they're also very toxic. So it's easy to make P2P when you have these chemicals, and there's a lot of different combinations for making P2P. What that means is there's no way for the government to control through regulating one chemical how you make this stuff. So they began, and if you have access to the shipping ports, which they do, you can bring in all kinds of these chemicals and make more than you've ever made with ephedrine meth. And that's exactly what began to happen. Ephedrine meth really was made in quantities that were large, but never able to cover more than like parts of the Western United States. The P2P meth begins to be kind of common knowledge, the way of making it and so on. And that meth begins to kind of march across the country, that staggering supplies. The same as with fentanyl. You can get all these chemicals in, you can make as much as you want, and fentanyl has kind of covered the country. Same happens with methamphetamine. Right about on the western side of the United States, my reporting, it's kind of like 2013-14 is when you begin to really see these surges in supplies, huge. And then Midwest is more like, say, 2017, right in there. 2019, it's up into parts of New England. So it's effectively kind of covering the country. And it's in many other states, Wyoming, Montana, it's in Georgia, and And it not only does that, it's also it drops the price. So the price collapses, meaning it's just everywhere. It's just so cheap. But along the way, my reporting found that that it also brought with it, or created with it, or is accompanied by, let's use that term, is accompanied by real rapid, scary onset of symptoms of schizophrenia, almost indistinguishable from schizophrenia, according to people I talk to. And I've talked to people all over the country now. Just this morning, I'm in Nashville. Just this morning, I met with folks at a homeless shelter who've been dealing with this meth for 2017. So it's in 5 years, basically, in Nashville. The price back then was $19,000 a pound for a pound of methamphetamine. Now it's $3,000 a pound. You can see the price drop is just staggering. But they also, along with that, you found these cases of people just, frequently going out of their minds on this stuff. It's no longer a party drug. It's no longer let's be around everybody and be everyone talkative. You're more withdrawn. You're into your brain. Your brain gets kind of stuck. It's the verb that most people use to describe what happens. And you become extraordinarily paranoid. Everybody's out to get you. There's bugs. There's microphones everywhere. You're certain that the government's going to kill you, and all your friends, And along with this comes this meth-induced psychosis, mental illness, and homelessness. People who are in that situation are very difficult to live with. They don't want to follow rules. People don't want to be around them because they're very scary. So you begin to see this rise of homelessness too, as the meth begins to march across the country. And then you begin to see also the formation of tent encampments. Tent encampments become a perfect place for you to live if you're on this stuff. And a place for you to kind of go hide, and a place for you to be around others who are also doing the same. And they become very difficult to leave. If you're on meth, going to treatment, going to a shelter, going to a warming center in dead of winter, people don't do it. It's very, very difficult to get people into treatment on this meth. So this meth is accompanied by these problems that are affecting big cities, but also small towns and rural areas. Increased homelessness, increased mental illness, tent encampments, and all that comes along with this meth.
It's really interesting that the tent encampments, because when we moved to Austin, and we've seen them in LA and San Francisco, and I never really understood why now. And it really does make a lot of sense that something must have changed that would make it that. I mean, I never remember there being, homeless people, sure, but these just endless encampments of homeless people. Yeah. And it really is that they're on this new version.
Yes, I think when you talk to people who work in this daily, ER docs, homeless outreach people, paramedics, shelter workers, and that kind of thing, that's where and recovering addicts, of course, as well, people in treatment and so on. And drug counselors, all those folks will tell you these stories. And what's more, Stephen, it's amazing thing. You find the same story. I mean, the same story is in Albuquerque, as in Nashville, where was I a month ago? Southern Indiana, across from Louisville, Kentucky, is in Portland, is in Skid Row, LA, you get the same stories, and the tent encampments have all exploded. And these are in very, very areas with very high housing costs, and also areas with very low housing costs. I mean, Skid Row area, Rust Belt areas, like the 3 chapters that I wrote about Clarksburg, West Virginia, in the Least of Us, talk about this a lot. It's like, this is a town that never had any homeless people, really, and never had any it's a Rust Belt town, basically. It has very low housing costs. A lot of people own their homes because they've been there for decades. And all of a sudden this meth comes in, and pretty soon you have this enormous flood of homeless people just everywhere downtown, in these little wooded areas living. And there it's kind of part tent encampment, part abandoned house squatting. It's kind of a mix, but the idea that it's only in wealthy, high housing cost areas is a myth. This is all over the country. And again, those tent encampments serve as like The way I like to think of it is kind of like Cheers, the sitcom Cheers, where everybody knows your name, well, the 10 Commandments are like where everybody knows your nickname, and you just want to be around other people who are using and have access to the drugs. And even though it's terrifying, you're always using, because that's the insanity of addiction. Addiction is, muting all your all your impulses for self-preservation and turning you enslavement into enslaved to the dope. You're obedient to the dope. And that's exactly what those tent encampments are. And they're places where there's horrible exploitation, vile, filthy places, that kind of thing. But yes, they have exploded since this meth has taken over. And the more you talk to those people, the people who work in it and who see it every day, the clearer it becomes.
What is unique about this new meth? Is it the P2P that changed it? Do they understand that?
It's a really good question. And the truth is, there's been no studies of it, of this street meth and why it's creating this problem. There is no rat study. There's no mice study. There's no neuroscience. What I'm giving you is street reporting. It's not scientific. There is no scientific study of P2P meth as it's constituted now on the streets of many parts of the United States. So I can't answer what is going on with there's a few possibilities. One is it's, contaminated with these chemicals that it's used to make it. That's one option. I would say that sounds like a possibility. The other is that it's due to simply the potency of the meth that they're making down there is extraordinarily potent. That's possible. It could be that it's the time of use, that you just use it and you gradually become this way. The truth is, I don't believe that's actually the case. You hear too many stories of people very quickly entering mental illness almost within hours of having used this stuff. So it's not like it's something that is due to prolonged use, although certainly the prolonged use will be devastating to your brain. There could be a lot of reasons for it, but I have to say that wherever you go, you hear the same stories of people not, social workers not being able to tell whether a person is organically and mentally ill or just, meth-induced mentally ill. And they look the same, or they look very, very similar. The only way you can really tell is to get that person into detox, have that person be, away from the dope, purge that crud from the system, and then find out if what's going on. And frequently the folks who were on meth, they will get somewhat better. They won't, it's a scary thing that they don't seem to actually return to where they were before. But so much of our homelessness, it's either caused by this, or the other thing that happens is that it's so prevalent on the streets that you don't have if you're homeless for whatever reason and you're using this stuff, you are going to have a horrible time getting back on your feet and getting into housing and getting your mind to a place where where you're able to follow rules and you're not screaming at the walls at 3 a.m. and stabbing the carpet and all this kind of stuff that people are routinely do when they're on this form of methamphetamine. So it in some cases it creates homelessness. In many cases it prolongs it and makes it very difficult to get out of. And then I believe is basically the glue that holds those tent encampments together.
What do you see as the kind of the marketing, I guess, for the lack of a better word, of how are these people getting into the meth? Like the fentanyl, I can see it's a natural progression from the opioids, and it's kind of giving you the same thing, but this meth just seems completely off the wall. How are people getting into that? That's
a very good question. One of the things that got me into this story was that I began to see something I had never seen before in 35 years as a crime reporter. And that was that people who are addicted to opioids were now using methamphetamine. And in fact, they could be using Suboxone, which is used to control the cravings. It's part of the treatment for opioid addiction. They would be on Suboxone, but their lives were still kind of wrapped up in the drug world. So as soon as this meth starts showing up, and the meth is very, very cheap, doesn't have the withdrawals that opioids have. There's all these like benefits. You won't die on it, supposedly. That proves not to be the case, but it's certainly not like the opioids where you overdose and very easily. And so they began to migrate to it because of the prevalence of the supply. And again, these are stories that are not about demand. This is about supply creating demand, right? And you see that with fentanyl. Fentanyl laced into cocaine creates eventually a fentanyl user. That's not what the cocaine user had in mind when he bought his cocaine, right? And the same is true with methamphetamine. I think you find so much of it in the sense that you find the supply is so vast that people can't avoid it on the street if they're already on the street. If they're trying to still get high but don't want to use opioids again, they switch there. I found that over and over. That was what really, as I said, that struck me. I'd never seen that. You never see en masse the user of opioids, heroin and whatever, switching to a stimulant, a depressant, switching to a stimulant like methamphetamine. It's never happened in the history of our country, certainly not in the numbers that we're seeing today. So that's part of it. Part of it is once you're on the street, meth is actually helps you endure homelessness. That's one of the I guess, quote unquote benefits of methamphetamine. You're up all night, so you're not asleep. You're not prey to people who would be looking to hurt you when you're asleep. You're warmer because your body's revving at very high metabolism, very high heart rate. You also, frankly, it's the meth itself that become the delusional psychotic effects of meth that become an attraction, because now you're on the street. You don't know you're on the street. You're out of your mind. You're out of your, you're disconnecting from the grim, very, rough reality that you're living in. So all of that, it's a good question. I mean, because it never has really happened before. Only now in the last few years are you seeing this. But it's a remarkable thing to watch. I had never seen it myself, and that's what got me interested in it. But you see this many places in the country now.
Is there a way out of it for people? You did a lot of case studies, and do you see that there's something that's working for people who get off of this meth?
I have to tell you, with methamphetamine, it's very difficult because there is no medical treatment for methamphetamine addiction. You just have to be away from the dope. And I would say that it's very difficult with fentanyl too, because there's no such thing as a long-term fentanyl user. You're going to die. Eventually, the mix will be bad. You may be very tolerant to it. You may have a high tolerance to fentanyl, but eventually you're going to hit a mix that just very poorly mixed, and you're going to die. So there's no such thing as a fentanyl user on the street. So both of those are extraordinarily difficult to deal with. I think that's one of the reasons I included the 3 chapters on Kenton County, Kentucky, and The Least of Us. It talks about new ways of doing jail. To me, that feels like the best opportunity. What then needs to happen is people need to be arrested, taken off the street. We're talking about harm reduction here. If you stay on the street, you're going to die. You're going to go mad. So we're going to take you off the street. We're going to arrest you for those needles. We're going to arrest you for the stolen property and all that kind of stuff. And we are going to then put you in a jail setting, but a jail setting that's been rethought. And that's what's happening in some counties across the country, where they're rethinking how to do jail, what to do about jail, what should jail be. It's increasingly a place. If people are imagining a place where recovery can begin. And that's why I wrote those 3 chapters on that one county in Kentucky, where they've been doing that for 7 years now, and they've really thought it out. And there's it's pretty advanced experiment in how to redo jail. Not a panacea, not a cure-all. There is no cure-all for all this, but it's what I also liked about it was to watch as it kind of built a constituency for new ways of dealing with addiction, but very important to get people off the street. There is really no safe place on the street if you're addicted or using one of these two drugs. The methamphetamine now comes with fentanyl in it too, so very easy for you to die on that stuff. All of which means I think we need to be in the process of pushing people off the street into treatment. The tent encampments are the last place they need to be.
That struck with me. It's that it's tough on crime that you're putting these people in jail for very little, but you're getting them in there. But it's a very different jail experience than basically, I taught in jail for a little while, and it was almost like a breeding ground or a university for crime in a lot of ways. But this, what you described in Kenton County, is a very different. They're teaching them, like that guy I don't know why that one anecdote hit me. He went and cut in front of the other people who hadn't gotten their slice of pizza yet, and he just couldn't comprehend that he wanted pizza, and it's a personality type that he wanted more pizza. Well, when somebody sat down and explained to him, well, those other people didn't get their pizza yet, and it seemed to have clicked with the guy. Was that somebody you actually had met with?
Yes. Yeah. Sure. No, I mean, that's the criminal addictive thinking mind. Me first, whatever I want, I'm going to get it, and that's one of the things that needs to be relearned, very clearly, You're right. Other jails, settings and really most jail settings in America, really for decades have been places where people just sit and vegetate and learn how to be better and then spend lots of time designing their next score once they get out. And then of course that fails or it doesn't work the way they want it to. And so anyway, they're in and out all the time. And I think that jail can be a place where you arrest people but not with the intention of sending them to prison. You're trying to get them off the streets and begin that process of recovery. And for so many people, jail has always been just part of the drug war. And my feeling is that the longer you allow people through decriminalizing drug use, through decriminalizing minor drug sales, decriminalizing fentanyl sales, that's an insane idea. And there's no such thing as a minor sale of fentanyl. Everybody is going to, you're going to do damage to people by selling that stuff. We need to get them people off the street. The longer they're on the street selling or using, irreversible damage is going to a better chance of occurring. And that means death or madness, one of the two, or brain damage, really, in the case of meth as well. But so it feels to me like that is what the new situation on the streets of America is really crying out for, is a kind of a rethinking old ideas. The drugs have changed, our thinking hasn't.
One of the things that you pointed out in the book, and it kind of reinforced something that I had noticed, is Walmart's involvement in all of this. And you hate to just focus in on Walmart, but in our town, a small town, they had a Walmart. It was not a small town, medium-sized town, but the Walmart produced such a large amount of the police calls that the police couldn't go to other things. And sometimes it would take in 2 or 3 officers off the street. And this was multiple times a day. Yeah. And the Walmarts, can just explain to us what Walmarts have done?
Sure. I think, thanks for asking about that. It's a very interesting part of this whole phenomenon. And that is Walmarts, kind of were the finishing blow to a lot of main streets around, like mom and pop or locally owned, not just mom and pop, but locally owned stores have been around for a long time, supported families, supported other institutions within the town, churches, little leagues, junior high theater, local sports, all that kind of stuff was supported by a lot of these main street businesses, right? And then Walmart comes in and they don't do any of that, of course. They just destroy these businesses. Of course, they're offering prices that are half or a third or way lower than the mom and pops can offer. And of course, that becomes the only real benefit. But what ends up happening is in a lot of towns that Walmart becomes the fountain, the source of most of the revenue used to buy drugs. The reason that happens is because Walmart does not do enough, and historically has not done enough to keep people from ripping off the store. They have insurance. I know they don't want to be ripped off, but they aren't willing to invest significant amounts of money the same way Target is, for example. You go into a Target, you go into Walmart, a very different scene. The Target is the very bright lights, wide aisles, lots of employees. Well, that costs money that Walmart doesn't want to pay. And so you go into a Walmart, very narrow aisles, dim lights, you hardly ever see an employee. And what that means is that people who can rip off Walmart very easily It's notoriously easy. I've heard so many stories about how do you rip off Walmart using all these different ruses, and you can just walk out with stuff sometimes, and then the people will not say it, have in the past anyway. I think that's changing a little bit, I have to say. But what that means is that a lot of that stuff. Now, some of that is stuff that people just can't afford stuff, and it's Christmas or they didn't need food or whatever. Certainly part of that, I think, is going on. But a big part of what's going on in the shoplifting of Walmart is taking that stuff and selling it or bringing it to the dope dealer and getting your dope in exchange. And it's the lubricant that allows the drug business in your area to prosper. And this is particularly true in areas without a lot of other retail options. You might have a Kroger's, maybe, but the Walmart is notorious. Of all the box stores, no other chain has the reputation for being so easy to rip off. And so the exchange that a region or a county or a town gets is you get cheaper prices, but you lose your main street business that are owned by local folks. You get cheaper prices, but you also get a very easily funded drug business. And the smaller the town, the more isolated the town, the more that's the case, it seems to me. It's not that people don't rip off other stores, Lowe's and, all the big box stores. That's certainly true. They rip off their family, they rip off houses and that kind of thing. But Walmart seems to stand out as the place where you find so much of that kind of shoplifting, and then shoplifting that is very much connected to what the dealer wants. Very often the dealer, I've run into several cases of stories of this where the dealer would be making lists of what he needs. You bring me my, size, my kid's shoes because it's August and my kid needs to start school again. And, you give me this, boom, boom, and you bring us, T-bone steaks. We need this. We're kind of hungry, that kind of thing. And I'll give you the dope. And it's all so easy to rip off Walmart. And again, also what it does is, as you say very correctly, it just sops up police time. And in some places, I think I talked with the city of Paducah, Kentucky, which had this problem very badly. And they began to say, if it's, first Walmart was just insisting you have to come whenever we call. And the cops were saying 15% of our calls are for your store, your two stores. That's absurd. We're not going to do it. So they put in a system where if it's under $500 in value, the loss, the arrest and all that kind of stuff for the guy was stealing under, then you file it online and that'll be it, because we're not going to show up anymore. You have to. And there's this idea that really Walmart needs to rethink a lot of what it's doing and understand that the cost of low prices. Again, it's the high cost of low prices, as that one documentary was about. The high cost of low prices is reflected in the fact that you not only have an enormous drain on police resources, but a lot of that money is going to fund your dope business and expand the dope business in your town or region.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, it's a very tricky problem to unravel because that, just setting markers, if it's only $500, that's hurting the businesses that do take shoplifting seriously, because they can't just say, well, we're not going to answer Walmart's calls. They have to have these blanket policies that wind up hurting everyone, because they've essentially, Walmart's farmed out security to them.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is really devastating for a community, it seems to me. And the way you learn how this it happens is you just talk to recovering addicts, and they will tell you forever how they did this. It's a remarkable thing. I've done this many a time, listen to these stories about, I would go and find a receipt in the parking lot of Walmart. I'd go into the store, rip off what was on the receipt, and come back and exchange it. One guy told me I never would even leave the store with my stuff. I technically wasn't even stealing it. I would fill up a cart with some big item and then go march it over to the return And for a long time, they weren't even asking for receipts, and in his case, they never asked for receipts. He said, and I would just take some big patio table or something like that. I'd say, I need this. This doesn't fit in my patio. I thought it would. And, and so they gave us a gift card, You walk that over to your drug dealer, he'll give you half of whatever the value is, $100 gift card, then you can get $50 in dope, He never even really stole the thing, essentially. It was a remarkable thing to see all the different ruses. What that means is that people know, and people spend a lot of time ingeniously devising these things. Sometimes it's just running out and jumping into a car, But every drug dealer knows this. I've talked to so many folks like this now. It's like wherever you go, you're going to find somebody who understands that a big part of his business is stuff coming from Walmart.
Where do you see drugs in this evolving to in the future? I get this wrong all the time, so I'm reluctant to kind of be too predictive of the future. I mean, wouldn't have told you fentanyl was going to be an issue when I was writing Dreamland. I mean, not to the extent that it is today, for goodness sake. So just because you write a book doesn't mean you can predict the future. I would say the synthetic drugs, I think, unless something happens and Mexico begins to get serious about inspecting its ports and making sure that those chemicals are accounted for and where they're going and all that kind of stuff, unless that begins to happen, and that does not seem to be on the drawing board anywhere in Mexico, unless we are willing to get serious about the guns that are bought here and smuggled into Mexico, ensuring all that impunity on the part of those traffickers, unless that kind of stuff happens, I think synthetic drugs will continue to be the thing. There may be different synthetic drugs. There's already new synthetic drugs I talked about at the end of The Least of Us, the nitazene drugs, different kinds of those that were synthesized in the 50s or 60s by a Swiss company and never really put into commercial use, but they're out there to be used by the trafficking world, and you've been seeing that showing up across the country in certain amounts. I also think that the drug world is increasing, the drug trafficking world is increasingly painting itself, though, into a corner. The more potent the dope, the more deadly the dope, the fewer people all across, the more that word crosses, and is spread, the lower the population of customers will eventually be. And you'll find that what people will come to understand, which is what I wrote in the book, which is that we have reached the end of low risk recreational drug use, which developed in the 60s and 70s and was, oh yeah, it's cool to take a line of cocaine at a party, that kind of thing. Yeah, that stuff's going to kill you, as these overdoses have shown over and over and over, So where does it lead? Where is it all going? It's an excellent question. I'm not really sure I can answer that very clearly always, but it seems to me that synthetics, because they are a boon and a profit and of enormous benefit to traffickers, that's what they're going to continue to make until that changes. And it just makes more sense from their point of view. The subtitle of your book is Hope in a Time of Meth. Can you leave us with a little bit of hope here?
I think, well, it's kind of tough in a shorter time because that's really like half the book. But the idea that I had was that this epidemic, or this whole addiction epidemic, is all about, one thing it's about is showing us how far away we have strayed from how it's really healthy and prosperous for us to live. We're all so isolated. We're on screens all the time. We're eating crappy food, and it's showing us also the importance of community in such an important way, and it's showing us how we need each other, and the pandemic was doing the same. And to me, it's this epidemic is showing us, asking us or pushing us to rethink how we're living. and how isolated we are, the kind of crap that we eat, all that kind of stuff. It did for me. I stopped drinking soda. I don't eat near as much junk food as I once did, Snickers and M&Ms and all that stuff. I've just cut out a lot of that. I exercise and work out a lot more. All of that stuff becomes part of my life, as does seeing the importance of being around other people, of being in community with others, maybe being outside the house, being, in conversations with people, being, I think a lot of this that's calling on us to do is really kind of low tech stuff. Barbecues and block parties, do that more. This kind of stuff there's more to it, and we don't really have time to talk about all the stuff that goes into what I'm trying to get across in this book when it comes to that. But I do feel that this epidemic of addiction is showing us and calling on us to rethink how we've been living as Americans, and move out of the house, move into more direct connection with other people. And if we'll use that lesson, if we'll respond to what it's calling on us to do, I think it'd be an enormously hopeful thing. Yes, I think this book, it sounds very dour and so on. I know people have said that's a grim book. Well, no. Yes and no, it is grim. It's a grim thing we face. On the other hand, the potential for what can come out of this, people just using far less drugs. I mean, to me, that's a lot. That's a big deal. But also just kind of looking to see ways of just kind of being together more. To me, that is like enormously hopeful. And that's kind of where, and the idea too, that we're, what have we learned from all this? That we're only as strong as the most vulnerable. We're only as strong as the least of us, which is why I titled the book that way. That's why the book has that title, is because it's showing us that these kinds of lessons are inherent in this addiction epidemic, and we'd be very, very foolish to ignore these lessons, seems to me.